The explosion on the Crimea Bridge sent shockwaves far beyond the Black Sea. It was more than just a physical attack on infrastructure, it was a strike at the heart of Russia's strategic and symbolic power. The bridge, officially called the Kerch Bridge, connects mainland Russia to Crimea, which Moscow annexed from Ukraine in 2014. For Russia, it was a proud engineering achievement and a potent symbol of dominance over Crimea. For Ukraine and much of the world, it represented occupation and aggression. When it was hit by a massive blast, the international community watched in shock and anticipation, knowing that the event could reshape the dynamics of the war and global geopolitics. Almost immediately, the Kremlin called the explosion a terrorist attack orchestrated by Ukrainian intelligence. President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of trying to destroy a vital link that connected Russia with Crimea, calling it an act of war meant to intimidate Russian citizens. Russia's response was swift and furious. Within hours, Russian missiles rained down on Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia. Civilian areas were struck, and blackouts spread across Ukraine as power stations were targeted. The message from Moscow was clear: any attack on Russian assets will be met with overwhelming retaliation. Ukraine, on the other hand, maintained a strategic silence. While officials did not immediately claim responsibility, the tone from Kyiv was unmistakably triumphant. Memes circulated online showing the bridge in flames, and Ukrainian media hinted that this was a consequence of Russia's illegal occupation. Later, some reports from Ukrainian intelligence sources suggested that the operation was a coordinated sabotage designed to disrupt Russia's military supply lines to southern Ukraine, particularly to its forces in Kherson and the Crimean Peninsula. Whether Ukraine officially admitted responsibility or not, the world understood that this was a major blow to Russia's logistical and psychological position in the war. International reactions were divided, reflecting the fractured global order shaped by the war. Western nations, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and members of the European Union, refrained from direct commentary on the attack itself, but reaffirmed their support for Ukraine's right to defend its territory. Officials in Washington emphasized that Russia alone was responsible for the ongoing war, and that the destruction of its infrastructure in occupied areas was a natural consequence of its aggression. European leaders echoed this sentiment, pointing out that the Crimea Bridge was built illegally on annexed land, and that its destruction highlighted Russia's vulnerability. In contrast, countries sympathetic to Moscow, such as China, Iran, and North Korea, criticized the attack as an escalation that risked widening the conflict. Beijing called for restraint and urged both sides to avoid actions that could destabilize the region further. Iran, already supplying drones to Russia, accused the West of pushing Ukraine into reckless acts of sabotage. These contrasting narratives highlighted how the explosion was not just a battlefield incident but a global propaganda event, with each side using it to reinforce its political stance. The incident also had deep psychological implications inside Russia. The bridge had been heavily guarded, with naval patrols, drones, and air defense systems constantly monitoring it. Its destruction exposed vulnerabilities that the Kremlin had tried to hide. Russian citizens who once believed in the security of Crimea suddenly faced the reality that even one of the most fortified symbols of Russian pride could be struck. Social media in Russia erupted with anger and disbelief. Nationalist bloggers and war correspondents blamed Russian generals for incompetence, while state media scrambled to control the narrative, insisting that the damage would be quickly repaired. Putin's image as a strong leader capable of protecting Russian territory suffered another major blow. For Ukraine, the symbolism of the attack was enormous. The Crimea Bridge had served as a supply artery for Russian military convoys, delivering weapons, ammunition, and fuel to the southern front. By targeting it, Ukraine not only disrupted Russia's logistics, but also struck a powerful psychological victory. The message was that Crimea, which Russia considered untouchable, was no longer safe. Ukrainian morale soared, and the world saw that Ukraine was capable of hitting deep behind enemy lines. Strategically, the explosion complicated Russian troop movements, forcing them to rely on longer, less secure routes through occupied territories. In global diplomatic circles, the explosion became a point of tension and debate. The United Nations called for de-escalation, warning that further attacks on critical infrastructure could lead to catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The European Union debated new rounds of sanctions, targeting Russian defense and logistics sectors. NATO reiterated its commitment to supporting Ukraine's defense, but officials were careful not to appear as though they endorsed attacks on Russian territory. This delicate balance reflected the West's challenge, supporting Ukraine's sovereignty without triggering a direct confrontation with Russia. Financial markets also reacted to the event. Oil prices briefly spiked amid fears that the conflict could intensify and disrupt global energy supplies. Russia's ruble weakened, and investor confidence in Moscow's economic stability wavered. The bridge had served not only as a military route, but also as a commercial one, symbolizing Russia's connection to Crimea as an integrated part of its economy. The attack reminded investors and governments alike that the war in Ukraine was far from over and that its ripple effects could reach every corner of the global economy. The explosion also reshaped public perception of the war in many parts of the world. In the West, it reinforced the idea that Ukraine was fighting back effectively against a much larger invader. Images of the bridge engulfed in flames circulated widely on social media, becoming a visual symbol of Ukrainian resistance. In Russia, however, the Kremlin used the incident to justify its renewed missile campaign against Ukraine, portraying itself as a victim of Western-backed terrorism. State TV channels emphasized the need for unity and revenge, stoking nationalism and suppressing dissenting voices. Meanwhile, in regions like the Middle East, Africa, and South America, the reactions were more pragmatic. Countries dependent on Russian grain and energy watched the situation carefully, fearing further disruptions to supply chains. Many governments expressed concern about escalation but avoided taking sides, reflecting the complex geopolitical web of economic interests tied to both Moscow and Kyiv. For them, the explosion was another reminder that the war's consequences extended far beyond Europe's borders. The event also raised difficult legal and moral questions. Could the bridge, located in occupied territory, be considered a legitimate military target? Under international law, infrastructure used for military purposes can be attacked, but Russia argued that this was terrorism against civilian property. Ukraine countered that the bridge served primarily to supply the occupying army and therefore was a valid target. Legal experts around the world debated the issue, but the larger reality was that in modern warfare, the lines between civilian and military infrastructure have become increasingly blurred. In the months following the explosion, Russia intensified its airstrikes on Ukrainian cities, framing them as retaliation. Civilian casualties mounted, and critical infrastructure across Ukraine suffered heavy damage. Yet, Ukraine remained defiant, and Western aid continued to flow in the form of weapons, financial support, and humanitarian assistance. The attack on the Crimea Bridge, though costly and risky, strengthened the perception of Ukraine as a nation capable of strategic, high-impact operations. It also forced Russia to divert significant resources to protect its assets in Crimea and along the Black Sea coast. On the international stage, the incident deepened the isolation of Russia. Western sanctions tightened, and diplomatic ties with Europe eroded further. At the same time, Russia sought closer cooperation with countries like China and Iran, creating a new axis of mutual dependence that challenged the traditional Western-led order. The bridge explosion thus became a symbol not only of the military struggle between Russia and Ukraine, but also of the broader geopolitical realignment that the war had triggered. From a historical perspective, the destruction of the Crimea Bridge echoed other turning points in modern conflicts, where a single dramatic event shifted momentum and morale. It reminded the world that infrastructure can carry immense symbolic weight, as much a weapon of influence as a tool of logistics. The bridge, once a monument to Russian power, became a monument to its vulnerability. The explosion's reverberations were felt in every capital that had a stake in the war's outcome. In conclusion, the international fallout after the Crimea Bridge explosion went far beyond the immediate destruction of concrete and steel. It altered the trajectory of the war, challenged perceptions of security, and forced nations to reassess their alliances and strategies. For Russia, it was a humiliation that exposed its weaknesses. For Ukraine, it was a declaration that no occupied territory was beyond reach. For the rest of the world, it was another reminder of how fragile global stability has become in the face of great power conflict. The explosion on the Crimea Bridge was not just an event in the Ukraine war, it was a signal that the struggle for influence, territory, and legitimacy in the 21st century is being fought not only on battlefields, but in the very symbols that define nations.